right. So today we are going to be taking a deep dive into a stack of newspaper articles
Okay.
about the Hare Krishna movement in Hawaii,
Interesting.
focusing on a leader named Chris Butler.
Oh, okay.
Buckle up, because this deep dive takes us through the evolution of a spiritual movement as it gets intertwined with business, politics, and
Oh, wow.
even a bit of media controversy.
Sounds juicy.
It is.
I'm intrigued.
It's going to be interesting to see how these different aspects of Butler's movement played out,
Right.
especially from the perspective of the media.
Right. Yeah, because we are only working from
Yeah.
this newspaper article, so we're really going to be seeing
Yeah.
how the media
How they portrayed
this
this.
whole thing.
Yeah, so we're starting in 1970 with the young Chris Butler, going by Cy Young at the time, leading a Hare Krishna community in Haiku, Maui.
Okay.
The articles highlight how much influence he had over his followers' lives. Things like marriages, diets, even celibacy.
Early on, there are these hints of a potentially controlling environment, which raises questions about the nature of his leadership.
Yeah.
Was this genuine spiritual guidance, or was there a darker side to it?
That's a question that seems to follow Butler throughout his journey. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's talk about ISKCon.
Yes.
For those unfamiliar, it's the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, the main organization behind the Hare Krishna movement.
Right. And by 1977, Butler distances himself from ISKCon
Wow.
and emerges as the leader of his own branch of Krishna devotees in Hawaii.
Okay.
It's a significant shift, and his approach evolves too.
How so?
The articles mention less emphasis on the traditional street chanting and more focus on what Butler called love of God and working for the welfare of others.
Okay, so shifting away from some of the more visible outward expressions of faith.
Yes, exactly. And he even starts criticizing what he saw as corrupt politicians, advocating for leadership based on godly qualities.
Now, what exactly did Butler consider godly qualities in a political leader?
That's a good question. And
That's an interesting point to consider.
yeah, it's not really
Doesn't really define that.
spelled out in these articles, so
Right.
that's something.
Yeah, it seems like he's trying to apply these spiritual principles to a very real-world context.
Absolutely. And by 1982,
Okay.
he's hosting a TV show called Jagat Guru, meaning world teacher.
Wow.
It's a bold title for sure.
It is.
And he uses this platform to share his teachings with thousands of viewers.
That's spreading his message.
Yes, exactly. He talks about reincarnation, the nature of the soul, and the idea of transcending this cycle of life and death.
Okay, and how is his personality described?
Well, his on-screen persona is described as pretty unique.
Yeah.
Wearing leis, but maintaining this very serious tone.
Interesting.
It makes you wonder if it was a deliberate choice to project a certain image,
Right.
a juxtaposition.
Yeah, playing with those expectations.
Yeah, and the articles also point out that he's articulate,
Okay.
even humorous at times, making these often complex spiritual concepts more accessible to the average viewer.
He's described as easier to understand than some other gurus.
Right.
But at the same time, there are still these aspects that might raise eyebrows.
Like his followers bowing to the floor in his presence.
Yeah.
It's almost as if he's straddling two worlds, the traditional image of a spiritual leader and something more modern and approachable.
Right. And it's crucial to remember that we're getting all of this through the lens of the media.
Absolutely.
Their perspective shapes how this story is told.
Yes. So we've got this charismatic, somewhat enigmatic figure leading a growing spiritual movement in Hawaii. But it's about to get even more interesting.
Oh.
As we enter the political landscape of the late 1970s,
Okay.
here's where we encounter the Independence for Godly Government Party, or IGG.
Okay.
They seem to appear out of nowhere in the 1976 Hawaii elections, advocating for things like strict morality,
It's okay.
slow growth, and self-sufficiency.
An interesting platform.
Yes, and what's fascinating is that the media initially missed the connection, but eventually they uncovered that the IGG was heavily influenced by Butler's Krishna devotees.
Interesting. So there was that connection
Yes.
from the beginning.
Many of the candidates were actually his followers.
Wow.
And campaign donations were coming from individuals and businesses connected to his movement.
So a lot of support from that network.
Yes, and this is where things start to get a bit ethically murky.
Okay. How so?
There were attempts to downplay these Krishna connections, raising questions about transparency and whether there was an intentional effort to manipulate public perception.
Were they trying to avoid alienating voters who might be wary of a spiritual group's involvement in politics?
It's hard to say for sure.
It's hard to know their motivations.
But it definitely adds another layer to this story.
It does. And then there's Kathy Hoshio,
Yes.
a key IGG candidate and a follower of Butler.
Right.
She received a lot of attention from the media, facing accusations of hiding her spiritual practices.
She countered by saying her religious beliefs were a private matter. Right, of course.
But she also expressed fears of being smeared by powerful forces.
Wow.
And even concerns for her safety. Imagine the pressure she must have felt navigating this complex world of politics and spirituality.
Right. Yeah, that's a lot to deal with.
It really highlights the challenges of bringing spiritual beliefs into the political arena, especially when those beliefs might not align with the mainstream.
Right. It can be a difficult line to walk.
It can. And, we have to be careful, too, about judging the past by today's standards.
Right. Things were different then.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got this intriguing mix of spirituality, politics, and a bit of mystery brewing, but it doesn't stop there.
Oh, no, there's more to uncover.
Oh.
Let's explore how Butler's followers translated these spiritual principles into a network of businesses.
Okay, so they're branching out even further.
Yes. It wasn't just about politics.
Okay.
They were involved in everything from health food stores to farms, and even newspapers. Down to Earth emerges as a key player.
Down to earth.
Yes.
Okay, raising questions about the line between spiritual service and business practices.
Interesting. So they're really putting those principles into action.
Yeah, the article suggests that a lot of the labor in these businesses came from Butler's followers.
Okay.
Many working as volunteers. It makes you wonder about the motivations behind these ventures and whether there was a genuine desire to benefit the community or if there were other factors at play.
It makes you think about the power dynamics at play as well.
Right, and the potential for exploitation.
Exactly.
Especially since we see these close ties between Butler's movement and two newspapers,
Okay.
the Valley Isle and the Kauai Sun.
So they have their own media outlets.
In a way, yes. The staff, the content, even the advertising all reflected the IGG's political slant and those Krishna connections. It further blurs the lines between media, religion, and politics.
Wow. So they're really building a whole ecosystem.
It's like this intricate web of influence is forming, with each element reinforcing the others.
And is this seen as a positive or negative thing by the media?
Well, it's presented with a sense of caution.
Oh.
Like there's this underlying question of whether this is all being done ethically and transparently.
Right. And it's not without its controversies.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
For example, there was that Godfather rumor published in the Valley Isle
What?
that ended up in a lawsuit.
Wow.
This incident brought the paper's credibility into question and highlighted the real-world consequences of these interconnected ventures.
Yeah, when you're operating in that public sphere, those kinds of things can really come back to bite you.
Absolutely. And it also shows how these different aspects of Butler's movement, the spiritual, the political, the media, could intertwine in ways that created unintended consequences.
Right. Things don't always go according to plan.
Exactly.
Then there are the accusations against Butler himself, surfacing later alleging intolerance towards the gay community. These allegations complicate the picture of Butler and his movement even further.
It challenges us to look beyond the surface and consider the evolution of his teachings and the potential impact on his followers.
Okay, so before we wrap up part one, let's touch on Rick Reed,
Yes.
a former associate of Butler and a political figure in his own right.
Right. He was involved in local politics.
Reed got embroiled in a smear campaign scandal involving a confidential report of a political opponent.
And the articles suggest a possible connection back to Butler, which adds yet another layer of complexity and raises questions about the reach and influence of this spiritual network.
So we've gone from a small Krishna community in Haiku to this web of businesses, political campaigns, media ventures, and even accusations of smear campaigns. And at the center of it all is Chris Butler, a truly fascinating and complex figure.
It will be interesting to delve deeper into the later chapters of his story and the lasting impact of the Hare Krishna movement in Hawaii, but we'll save that for part 2.
Join us then as we continue this deep dive.
Welcome back.
So we left off with this complex figure, Chris Butler, and all these different ventures.
Yeah, lots of threads to follow.
And I think we need to go back to December 1970.
Okay, back to the beginning.
Well, not quite the beginning,
Right.
but back a little bit further.
Before the IGG.
Butler unexpectedly disbands his haiku group and joins the ISK Khan Temple in Manoa.
Oh, wow. So he's rejoining that main organization.
He is.
Interesting.
And it's a sudden shift after years of leading his own community. And it's especially striking because he tells a reporter he needed a spiritual master to guide him, despite having acted as the spiritual master for his own followers in haiku.
Oh, that's interesting.
That raises so many questions. What prompted this change of heart? Was he seeking deeper understanding, or were there other motivations at play?
Right. What's he searching for?
We can speculate, but the articles don't offer a clear answer.
Typical.
It reminds us that even as we piece together this story, there will always be elements of Butler's journey that remain shrouded in mystery.
A little enigma.
Right.
Okay, so fast forward a few years to 1977.
Okay.
Butler has once again broken away from ISKCon.
He can't stay away.
It seems not this time to establish his own branch of Krishna devotees in Hawaii. And it's not just a structural change. His teachings appear to have evolved as well.
In what way?
Absolutely. There's a noticeable shift away from the emphasis on street chanting that characterized the early Hare Krishna movement. Butler's focus seems to turn towards more practical applications of spiritual principles, like working for the welfare of others.
Okay, so less about the outward show and more about putting those beliefs into action.
Yes, exactly. And he doesn't shy away from addressing real-world issues, as we discussed earlier. He starts criticizing politicians he views as corrupt, advocating for leadership based on godly qualities.
Right, and it'd be interesting to know more about what he considered those godly qualities to be.
This idea of godly qualities in leadership is an interesting one. Did Butler elaborate on what he meant by that? Did his definition align with traditional Krishna teachings on leadership, or was it something he developed independently?
Yeah, good question. Unfortunately, the articles don't go into much detail about his specific definition.
Okay.
It's definitely something we could explore further if there are more resources available.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if he addressed that more directly somewhere else.
Right, but for now, we can see this shift as a potential attempt to bridge the gap between the spiritual and the practical.
Okay. And as Butler's movement becomes more involved in politics, it inevitably attracts greater scrutiny. The emergence of the Independence for Godly Government Party, or IGG, in the 1976 Hawaii elections really highlights this complex interplay between spirituality and politics.
And a lot of people watching them very closely.
Exactly. Remember, the media initially failed to recognize the strong connection between the IGG and Butler's followers. It was only later that they uncovered the extent of his influence, with many candidates being devotees and campaign donations flowing from individuals and businesses linked to his movement.
And that lack of transparency definitely raised red flags for some people.
It's a valid concern. Imagine being a voter at the time unaware of those connections.
Right, you might feel a little misled.
It raises questions about the nature of influence and the importance of transparency in the political sphere. Were voters making informed choices? Were they presented with all the necessary information?
It's also interesting to consider the perspective of the candidates themselves. Were they conflicted about revealing their spiritual affiliations?
Right. Was it a conscious choice to downplay those connections?
Did they worry about facing prejudice or being misrepresented?
It's a reminder that engaging in politics can be incredibly challenging, especially for those whose beliefs might not align with mainstream views.
Yeah, and it speaks to that potential for tension between personal faith and the demands of the public arena.
One figure who faced this challenge head-on was Kathy Hoshio.
Right, she was really thrust into the spotlight.
A key IGG candidate and a follower of Butler, the media attention she received was intense, with accusations of hiding her spiritual practices.
Right, they really went after her.
She defended her stance, stating that her religious beliefs were a private matter.
Well, and that's certainly a valid point.
Absolutely, but she also voiced concerns about being smeared by powerful forces and even fears for her safety. It's a stark reminder that the intersection of spirituality and politics can be fraught with risk.
Right. It's not for the faint of heart.
Definitely not, and these risks weren't limited to the political realm.
Oh, so there's more.
Butler's movement also ventured into the world of business, creating a network of enterprises ranging from health food stores to farms and even newspapers.
Okay, so they're diversifying.
This expansion into business raises some intriguing questions about the motivations behind these ventures. Were they genuinely altruistic, aimed at promoting a healthier lifestyle and sustainable living, or were there other factors at play?
Right, were they truly trying to benefit the community, or was it more about expanding their influence and maybe generating revenue for the movement?
Exactly. The articles highlight the significant role of volunteer labor from Butler's followers in these businesses, particularly Down to Earth, which became a prominent health food store in Hawaii.
Down to earth, okay.
It prompts us to consider the boundaries between spiritual service and business practices.
Right. Were those volunteers empowered by their contributions, or were they subject to exploitation?
Right. Were there clear boundaries in place, or was there pressure to contribute beyond what was reasonable?
These are important questions to consider, especially given the potential for power imbalances within spiritual communities.
And the close ties between Butler's movement and two newspapers, the Valley Isle and the Kauai Sun,
Right. We talk about those.
further blur the lines between business spirituality and media. Both papers featured staff content and even advertising that reflected the IGG's political slant and those Krishna connections.
So they had a pretty tight grip on the narrative.
It creates a sense of an interconnected ecosystem where different aspects of Butler's influence are intertwined and reinforcing each other. On one hand, it's a testament to the movement's ambition and reach. On the other, it raises questions about transparency and the potential for conflicts of interest.
It's a double-edged sword.
And those potential conflicts of interest manifested in real-world consequences. Remember that Godfather rumor published in the Valley Isle,
Oh, yeah, that caused quite a stir.
which led to a lawsuit. It damaged the paper's credibility and underscored the importance of journalistic integrity regardless of one's spiritual beliefs or political affiliations.
Right. Just because you have a particular agenda doesn't mean you can throw journalistic standards out the window.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that freedom of the press comes with great responsibility, and even publications driven by seemingly noble intentions can make serious missteps.
And then there were those later accusations against Butler himself alleging intolerance towards the gay community. These accusations, surfacing years later, further complicate the picture of the man and his movement.
Right. It adds another layer of controversy.
It challenges us to consider the evolution of his teachings and the potential impact on his followers. Did his views change over time?
It makes you wonder about those who followed him early on. Did they agree with these later pronouncements?
Did those changes alienate some followers or lead to internal conflicts within the movement?
Right. These are all questions we can consider.
It's a reminder that spiritual movements are not static. They are constantly evolving, adapting, and responding to the world around them. And those changes can lead to both progress and conflict.
Before we move on to part 3, let's circle back to Rick Reed.
Okay, keeps popping up.
That former associate of Butler who became a political figure in his own right. He found himself embroiled in a smear campaign scandal involving a confidential report about another politician.
Oh, right, that whole thing with the leaked report.
And the articles suggest a possible connection back to Butler, raising further questions about the reach and influence of the spiritual network.
Do they say anything specific about the nature of that connection?
It's pretty vague. They don't provide concrete evidence of Butler's direct involvement.
Okay, so it's more of an implication.
Yes, but the incident still highlights the potential for spiritual authority to extend beyond the realm of personal belief and into the complex world of politics where the stakes are often high and the lines between right and wrong can become blurred.
Right, and it makes you wonder about the ethical considerations. Did Butler ever advise his followers on how to navigate those gray areas?
So we've seen how Butler's movement expanded beyond its spiritual origins, venturing into politics and business, facing both successes and controversies along the way.
And at each turn, we've encountered questions about the nature of influence, the importance of transparency, and the potential for conflicts of interest. It paints a fascinating, if complex, portrait of a spiritual movement navigating the challenges of the real world. Welcome back to our deep dive into the Hare Krishna movement in Hawaii.
We've seen how this movement under the leadership of Chris Butler evolved over time, intersecting with
Yeah,
politics,
getting into all these different areas.
business media, and navigating a fair share of controversies along the way.
And it seems like as we explore these later chapters, we just see more of those threads continuing to weave together.
Right, revealing even more complexities and raising even more questions about Butler's influence.
Right, and the impact of his teachings on his followers.
It's like peeling back layers of an onion,
Yeah.
each one revealing a new facet of this fascinating story.
So let's pick up in 1982,
Okay.
when Butler is hosting that TV show we mentioned earlier,
Jagat Guru.
right? World Teacher.
Right, reaching thousands of viewers with his teachings on reincarnation, the nature of the soul, and the pursuit of spiritual liberation.
And he's described as pretty charismatic.
Yes.
In the articles, articulate, even humorous at times.
Yeah, they even compare him to Johnny Carson,
Wow.
saying he had this knack for making these often complex spiritual concepts more digestible for a wider audience.
So kind of like a spiritual entertainer in a way.
Yeah, it's interesting, though, because beneath that seemingly approachable exterior, there are still hints of that controlling aspect we discussed earlier.
Right.
His followers continue to bow to the floor when he enters a room, and he maintains these strict rules for his initiates forbidding meat, alcohol, drugs, and what he terms illicit sex.
It's that again, the modern medium of television used to broadcast these ancient spiritual teachings. But within this framework of strict discipline and devotion, Do you think this blend of accessibility and control contributed to his appeal?
It's certainly possible it might have resonated with those seeking a spiritual path that offered both structure and a sense of belonging. That kind of clarity.
Right, a sense of purpose.
Exactly.
Okay, so now fast forward to 1986.
8 years later.
And we find one of Butler's followers, Rick Reed, at the center of a political scandal.
Oh, right. This is where things get messy.
Reed, a former aide to the city prosecutor, is accused of leaking a confidential report containing damaging allegations about a political opponent.
Okay, so we're back in that world of politics.
And the articles point out that Reed allegedly discussed the contents of this report with none other than Chris Butler, his spiritual advisor.
Interesting, so that connection is still there.
It is, and it's important to note that Butler denies any involvement in the scandal, and Reed maintains his innocence.
Okay, so it's their word against the accusations.
But the incident still raises questions about the boundaries between Butler's spiritual guidance and the actions of his followers, particularly those involved in politics.
Right. Is there a point where that spiritual influence crosses a line into something else?
Right. It highlights the potential for spiritual authority to be perceived as worldly influence, whether intentionally or not. It also underscores the complexities of navigating ethical dilemmas when personal beliefs intersect with the pursuit of power.
It's a tricky situation, for sure.
And this theme of ethical dilemmas kind of continues to emerge as we move into the 1990s.
Okay.
In 1991, Butler and his followers publicly criticize the gay lifestyle, arguing that it goes against their understanding of God's laws and natural order.
Right, and this was a time when those views are being challenged more and more.
Right. This stance, of course, draws immediate backlash, with LGBTQ+ advocates accusing Butler and his followers of intolerance and hate speech.
It's a stark reminder that even spiritual movements that espouse love and compassion can hold views that are deeply divisive and potentially harmful.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue, and it's important to acknowledge the pain and harm those statements cause.
Absolutely. It forces us to confront the question of how we reconcile differing values within a diverse society.
Right.
Where do we draw the line between religious freedom and the responsibility to protect the rights and dignity of all individuals?
That's a debate that continues to this day, and it speaks to those complexities of navigating these sensitive issues. And speaking of complexities, they deepen as we encounter yet another layer of this story. In 1992, a woman named Umeko Walker releases a tape containing allegations of sexual misconduct against Senator Daniel Inouye.
Wow, that's a big one.
While Walker was a former campaign worker for, wait for it, Rick Reed.
Oh, wow. So there's that connection again.
And to add another twist, she also had ties to Kathy Hoshijo and the Down to Earth health food store, both connected to Butler's movement. It's remarkable how these seemingly disparate threads keep intertwining.
It really is. It's like a spider web, each strand connected to another.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it reinforces the idea that seemingly isolated incidents can be part of a larger pattern. It makes us wonder, how much influence did Butler truly wield?
Right. Was he orchestrating these events, or were these just coincidences?
And how did that influence manifest in the lives of his followers and the events unfolding around them?
These are questions we can't definitively answer.
Right, we just don't have enough information.
But they're important to consider nonetheless.
So after this deep dive into the world of Hare Krishna in Hawaii, what can we take away from it all?
Well, I think this journey has shown us that exploring a spiritual movement's history requires going beyond the surface.
Right, we can't just take things at face value.
It demands that we examine the evolution of teachings, the actions of its leaders and followers, and the intersections with broader societal forces.
We've witnessed those challenges of balancing spiritual ideals with real-world actions, and we've grappled with the ethical dilemmas that arise when personal beliefs collide with politics, business, and personal relationships.
And while we might not have definitive answers to every question we've gained, I think a deeper understanding of Chris Butler's movement, its complexities, its controversies, and its enduring impact on the landscape of Hawaii.
Ultimately, it's up to each individual to draw their own conclusions about the legacy of Hare Krishna in Hawaii. But we hope this deep dive has provided some valuable insights and sparked a curiosity to explore these themes further.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the world around you.